She's a happy little girl, comfortable in her own skin.
Wow, wow, wow.
Juanita is 7 years old, and in her room are all the usual things you'd expect: roller skates, flowers, a dollhouse. But she was born a boy, even though she always knew she was supposed to be a girl.
Hey, mamá, ¿qué pensión? Oh, lo uso para jugar. Y estas son las botas de invierno de mamá.
¿Y las usas?
Yo sí las uso. Toda la vida las uso.
Her mother, Mariana, a little unsure at first, followed the advice of a psychologist to better support her daughter in her transition.
We made the doll with a penis because we couldn't find one in Argentina. It doesn't exist. We made it for her because the therapist told us it would be good for her.
The family lives in Azul, a conservative town with a population of 70,000 people, some 300 kilometers away from the capital, Buenos Aires. Getting the community to accept Juanita's transition wasn't easy.
In some situations, like in hospital, she would get called by her male name. She'd answer, "That's not my name." It stressed her out a lot. So we decided to look into changing her ID.
They contacted a human rights lawyer to guide them through the bureaucratic steps needed to change the little girl's legal gender. Facundo Achaga took on the case in 2020 when Juanita was 5 years old.
I tried to get to know her a bit to see if she saw herself as a girl without being too intrusive. I asked her to draw herself. She drew herself with long hair and a dress.
When the lawyer asked her to write down her name, she wrote Juanita, the name she'd chosen for herself. The procedure for changing her ID papers took just 1 month. That's because since 2012, a gender identity law in Argentina enables citizens of any age to choose their gender and change it as they see fit. Argentina was the first country in the world to introduce such legislation, which even a decade later remains some of the most progressive in the world.
It's not necessary to have the opinion of a psychiatrist or psychologist, because with this law, being transgender is no longer considered a mental illness, and no surgery or medical treatment is required.
Over 9,000 people have officially changed their gender identity since the legislation came into force. Marcela Romero was one of the authors of the law. 10 years later, she's out on the streets to demand that legislators go even further.
El Estado argentino, la democracia, tiene una deuda con la población trans. Los derechos están, y esos derechos se llaman Ley Integral Trans, una ley que va a beneficiar a toda la población trans.
Further legal measures to foster greater social inclusion will be debated in Congress. But although Argentina is a pioneer in trans rights, trans people still struggle to access steady work.
The life expectancy of an Argentinian trans woman is just around 40 because of how excluded we are. We live outside of the system without access to healthcare, housing, jobs, and everything else that other people enjoy access to.
This discrimination can also escalate into hate crimes. In 2020, 129 people were killed because they were trans. Fiorella has had to deal with violence against trans people virtually her whole life. She says it's a part of society.
I lived on the street. I had to do sex work. I didn't finish my secondary education. I couldn't find a job. I've been hugely impacted by this.
Fiorella's story is just one of many. In Argentina, less than a quarter of trans people finish their secondary education, and the vast majority are either unemployed or working on unstable, short-term contracts. Most resort to prostitution to make ends meet. This large financial firm created a network called Pride Connection in 2018. The professional network promotes inclusive corporate policies to help the LGBT+ community to find jobs.
In a job interview, we use pronouns like he and her. So we just ask the candidate, what pronouns do you use? It's things like that we struggled with in the past.
Sebastian is one of 2 trans employees working at global financial firm JP Morgan. He was hired in 2020 and supervises a team of some 20 people. He hopes that his example will encourage companies to be more inclusive.
In our society, we don't think that trans people can work in a place like this. Just being here and having a managerial job in a multinational company is in some ways a revolutionary act.
In order for Sebastian's success to become more commonplace, the government has mandated a 1% quota of trans employees in the public sector. Private companies, meanwhile, are encouraged to hire them thanks to tax breaks. It's a measure that once again makes Argentina a global frontrunner in advancing trans rights.